The flash of camera lights collided with the taste of copper. My lip was split, bleeding down my chin while 600 wealthy strangers watched my husband's and still raised, suspended in that frozen moment of absolute contempt. The impact hadn't hurt as much as the silence that followed. That thick, suffocating silence where nobody moved, where nobody spoke, where everyone simply stared at the wreckage of a marriage dying on a marble stage. But the pain wasn't what broke the spell. It was what I did next before we go any further. Take a quick pause here. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments because I'm always curious. Now let's get into the story. 6 years earlier, I stood in a marble foyer the size of a tennis court, wearing a faded dress from a discount department store, while my new father-in-law Richard Ashford sat at a mahogany dining table long enough to seat a small nation. He swirled expensive scotch in a crystal glass, his eyes dragging across my face with the kind of contempt usually reserved for something stuck to the bottom of his shoe. My name is Mackenzie Reed. At that moment, I was 27 years old, 6 months back from a deployment in Syria, where I'd spent 20 months analyzing encrypted communications for US intelligence. I had a top-secret security clearance, a tactical mind trained to spot deception in microsecond reactions, and approximately $3 in my bank account. "We don't serve military rations in this home," Richard announced, gesturing at my worn shoes with his fork. "Try not to damage the table with those combat boots." My husband Gregory stood nearby, slicing into a rare steak without bothering to offer me a chair. He was handsome in the way that expensive tailors and inherited money could make anyone handsome. He smiled at his father's insult like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. I'd married Gregory 6 weeks earlier in a courthouse. My military discharge paperwork was still processing. I was broke, exhausted, and apparently now property of the Ashford family's entertainment. I said nothing. I'd learned in Syria that silence was a weapon. Silence meant they couldn't predict you. Silence meant they talked more than they should. Gregory draped his arm across my shoulders with all the possessiveness of someone branding cattle. "Don't be too hard on her, Dad. I'm helping her transition from the service. She needs time to adjust to real civilization." The contempt in that word, civilization, landed harder than any physical blow could have. 3 weeks into my new life as an Ashford, Gregory opened a joint bank account. He explained it was for my protection, a generous allowance that I'd need to justify with receipts for every penny. A jar of pasta sauce, a gallon of milk, a $12 prescription for Scout's arthritis medication. He'd examine each receipt like he was auditing national defense spending. "Do you understand how much you cost this family?" he'd ask. "Without the Ashford name, you'd be sleeping in your truck. The thing about abuse is that it layers itself, so gradually you don't notice you're suffocating until you're already underwater." Patricia, Gregory's mother, made a show of introducing me to her friends as the charity case Gregory rescued from destitution. She'd squeeze my hands after introducing me, as though I might suddenly understand gratitude or appropriate humility. Then came the corporate dinner, where 200 of Denver's financial elite were invited to the Ashford estate. Patricia dressed me in a maid's uniform and positioned me to serve cocktails while wearing an evening gown underneath, just visible enough for the guests to notice the contradiction, to get the joke. An older businessman asked me about my background. I opened my mouth to mention my quantitative analysis degree from Georgetown, my security clearance, my military service. Gregory was there before I could speak, his hand finding my wrist behind my back, twisting it sharply until pain shot up my arm. His laugh covered the sound of my quiet gasp. "She's not equipped for financial discussion," he told the table, keeping his grip tight. "Trust me, she's better off just serving the drinks." I catalogued every person at that table, every face, every name, every subsequent appearance at Ashford functions. In my training, we called this building the witness list. That night, after the house went quiet, I slipped down to Gregory's study. His computer password took me 40 seconds to crack using military-grade decryption techniques I'd learned in signals intelligence. The files that opened on his screen painted a different picture than the Ashford family's public reputation. Ashford Capital Partners was hemorrhaging money. Millions of dollars were being diverted through offshore shell companies to accounts in the British Virgin Islands. Gregory had opened accounts under aliases, funneled company funds into cryptocurrency wallets, purchased multiple luxury properties in Aspen and Vale, none of it documented in the official books. The really catastrophic piece. Ashford Capital had recently secured a $95 million telecommunications equipment contract with the Department of Defense. The forensic accounting trail revealed that Gregory had embezzled $38 million of that allocation, routing it through shell companies to cover his own expensive lifestyle and an ongoing affair with a younger woman he was keeping in a penthouse downtown. If federal auditors discovered this, every member of the Ashford family would face federal prosecution, wire fraud, defense contract theft, tax evasion. We're talking decades in federal prison. I printed the primary documents, folded them carefully, and buried them in my military field notebook. Then I methodically deleted every trace of my access, locked the desk, and walked upstairs to the master bedroom where Gregory was already asleep, snoring with the peaceful obliviousness of someone who had no idea his entire empire was about to collapse. I spent the next 5 years living a double life. By day, I was the subservient wife. I cleaned the marble floors on my knees. I organized Gregory's schedule, coordinated with Patricia's endless social obligations, walked scout through the grounds, while listening to lectures about proper posture and appropriate social positioning. By night, once the antique hallway clocks passed 1 a.m., I retreated to the basement server room and became something else entirely. An intelligence analyst, a forensic accountant, a tactical operator mapping the precise financial architecture of the Ashford family's fraud. I documented every illegal wire transfer, every offshore account, every fabricated expense report, every defense contract discrepancy. I built a digital archive so comprehensive that it would survive any legal challenge, any attempt at deletion or obstruction. I recorded conversations, audio files of Gregory confessing to his crimes, assuming I was too stupid to understand what he was saying, voicemails from his mistress, phone calls between him and his father discussing money laundering strategies. Scout would press against my leg under the desk as I worked, my retired military dog somehow understanding that his handler was fighting a war that nobody else could see. Every 2 weeks, I drove my aging pickup truck south on I-25 to Frank's Diesel Stop, a real diner that smelled like burned coffee and diesel exhaust. The kind of place where nobody asked questions and everyone minded their own business. Sitting in the back corner booth, in a grease-stained mechanic's jumpsuit, was my father, Colonel James Reed, director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. To the waitress who refilled his coffee, he was just an old veteran scraping by on a pension. To the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he was one of the most powerful military intelligence figures in the nation. My brother David, a lieutenant colonel in Army intelligence, would usually be there too, wearing civilian clothes that barely concealed his military bearing. My father didn't lecture me about leaving Gregory. He didn't question my tactical decisions or suggest I should prioritize marital stability over my safety. He understood military strategy. He understood that sometimes the most valuable intelligence comes from operating deep inside hostile territory. He brought me documents, federal procurement records, defense contract, irregularities, banking surveillance reports. All of it completely legal, all of it pointing toward the same catastrophic conclusion. The Ashford family's criminal enterprise was about to implode. One evening, my father opened a worn leather briefcase and withdrew a digital encryption key. This single token represented access to $300 million in the Reed family trust. Generational wealth, clean money, military pensions, inherited assets, decades of conservative investments. Whenever you're ready, he said, sliding the token across the formica table, we can end this. My brother produced legal documents, foreclosure filings, asset seizure petitions, federal receivership injunctions. Everything prepared, everything ready, everything waiting for my authorization. I pushed the envelope back across the table. Not yet, I said. The Ashford Capital Annual Gala is next week. I want them at absolute peak arrogance. My father nodded. He understood the importance of timing, of letting enemies believe they're winning right up until the moment you destroy them. The morning of the gala, I stood in the laundry room while Patricia supervised the final preparations. She'd hired professional stylists for herself and her 2 daughters. They were upstairs getting their hair styled into elaborate sculptures, their makeup applied by professionals, their evening gowns pressed and perfect. I was ironing a 5-year-old charity dress that Patricia had pulled from a donation bin. "Stay away from the photographers tonight," Patricia instructed, examining the neckline with a critical sneer. "We can't have the press thinking we waste money on people like you." I kept my eyes on the wrinkles, carefully verifying that the military flash drive containing 5 years of forensic evidence was safely stitched into the dress's inner lining. The dress looked like poverty. It felt like a weapon. An hour before the limousine arrived, Gregory called me into his study. He locked the heavy mahogany door behind us and moved to block the exit. He slid a 3-page legal document across his executive desk. "Sign this," he commanded. "It transfers $51 million of corporate debt directly onto your name as the primary guarantor. If federal investigators ever raid this company, you go to federal prison while I walk away clean." I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I subtly adjusted my dress cuff, activating the miniature audio recorder I'd sewn into the seam a year earlier. "Gregory," I asked quietly, "why does the corporate deficit equal $51 million when the Defense Department allocated only $95 million total?" He stared at me like I'd spoken in foreign language. Then he smiled, that arrogant, careless smile that came from years of believing he was surrounded by people too stupid to understand him. "I diverted $38 million through offshore accounts to cover my expenses," he admitted, his voice casual. "My apartment's in Aspen, my girlfriend's penthouse, my investment portfolio. The Pentagon doesn't care what defense contractors do with their money as long as the equipment gets delivered on time. Federal investigators never audit private company spending." He was still talking as I held the pen to the signature line and drew a symbol instead of my name. He was still talking as I walked toward the door, and he didn't stop me, completely confident in his control, completely unprepared for what was coming. The limousine ride to the Riverside Convention Center took 20 minutes. Richard and Patricia sat across from me in the rear-facing seats, drinking champagne, laughing about how they'd used the Gala to secure another $200 million in bank financing. "We're untouchable," Richard announced, gazing out at Denver's skyline. "The federal government doesn't have the sophistication to understand our operations." I sat in silence with my hand folded on my lap, feeling the weight of my father's satellite transmitter at the bottom of my clutch. The grand ballroom was everything Denver's elite could offer. Crystal chandeliers, soaring ceilings, 600 guests in designer clothes, representing millions in accumulated wealth and centuries of inherited privilege. Richard took the stage to deliver the keynote address. He talked about business integrity, about family values, about the responsibility of stewardship. Halfway through his speech, he paused. He looked directly at me standing near the stage, and he smiled. "That old soldier who drove Mackenzie here in that rusted pickup truck," he announced to the crowd, his voice dripping with contempt. "He should get down on his knees and thank us for taking his broken daughter into our family. Without the Ashford name, she'd still be begging for spare change." The crowd laughed. 600 people laughed at the public humiliation of my father, at my existence, at the supposed charity of these people who had spent 6 years systematically destroying my dignity. I walked forward 1 pace and leaned close to Richard's ear. "If you don't address the $51 million structural deficit on your offshore ledgers within the next hour," I whispered with absolute calm, "there won't be a corporate empire left for anyone to inherit by sunrise." Gregory heard the warning. His face turned purple with rage at my defiance. He lunged across the stage, raised his hand, and brought it down across my face with all the force he could generate. The sound cracked across the silent ballroom like a gunshot. My head snapped to the side. Blood filled my mouth. My lips split open against my teeth. The collective gasp from the crowd seemed to come from very far away. Gregory stood over me, breathing heavily, his face twisted with contempt. He raised his hand again. "Shut your mouth," he sneered. "Another word and I throw you out into the gutter where you belong." The burning pain across my cheekbone didn't trigger tears or panic. It snapped the final chain binding me to civilian pretense. I stood up slowly, straightening my shoulders until my posture reflected the bearing of a military intelligence officer. I reached up, calmly wiped the bright red blood from my lip, and looked directly at Gregory, then at Richard, then at the 600 staring guests. I smiled. A cold smile. An executioner's smile. I reached into my clutch, pulled out my encrypted military phone, and pressed the single speed dial connected to my father's command post 3 miles away. The line connected on the second ring. My father's voice was steady, waiting for the authorization he'd been preparing for 6 years. I didn't explain what had happened. I didn't mention the assault or the humiliation. I spoke with the clarity of a military commander issuing a tactical order that would be broadcast through the stage's surround sound system to every person in the ballroom. "Dad," I said, my voice echoing through the massive room, "prepare to activate. I'm authorizing the full financial strike. Buy out the lives of this entire family tonight." I terminated the call and pressed the red activation button on the satellite transmitter twice. The response was immediate. The mahogany double doors at the rear of the ballroom were thrown open with a thunderous crash. 12 armed federal agents from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service marched into the room in precise formation, flanking every exit, executing federal arrest warrants. Walking beside the lead agent was my brother David, still in his lieutenant colonel dress uniform, carrying federal seizure orders in both hands. 2 federal marshals positioned themselves between me and the hotel security, their hands on their utility belts. The security guards stood down immediately, recognizing federal authority. David ascended the stage, nodded respectfully to me, and handed the federal freezing injunction directly into Richard's hands. The moment Richard's fingers touched the document, his authority ceased to exist. I walked calmly to the audio-visual control console at the side of the stage and retrieved the military encrypted flash drive from my clutch. I inserted it into the master port. The massive LED screen suspended above the stage illuminated with high-resolution digital images of Gregory's offshore bank accounts, his alias email accounts, his illegally diverted defense contract funds, his cryptocurrency wallets, his purchase records for the penthouse apartment he'd rented for his mistress. The audio system crackled to life, broadcasting the voice recording I'd captured in Gregory's study that morning. I diverted $38 million through offshore accounts to cover my expenses. His voice echoed across the ballroom. My apartment's in Aspen, my girlfriend's penthouse, my investment portfolio. The Pentagon doesn't care what defense contractors do with their money. Gregory lunged toward the console, screaming that it was AI voice cloning, that I'd hacked his computer, that it was all some elaborate deception. A special agent grabbed him by his Armani lapels and threw him hard against the stage floor. The agent began reading Gregory his Miranda rights while handcuffing his wrists behind his back. Wire fraud, defense contract theft, federal embezzlement. Richard tried to make a run toward the exit, but federal agents moved to block his path. Patricia collapsed in a chair, her face buried in her hands, her high society friends recording the entire humiliation on their phones. I stood beside the podium, looking down at Gregory sprawled in handcuffs, and spoke calmly into the stage microphone. "The federal asset seizure is officially live," I announced. "The Ashford Capital Partners is now under United States government control." The ballroom doors opened for the second time. My father entered the room wearing his formal army dress blue uniform. His chest blazed with 3 rows of combat medals and campaign ribbons earned over 4 decades of military service. Gleaming on his shoulders were the 4 silver stars marking him as a full United States Army general. He wasn't the old mechanic anymore. He was General James Reed, one of the most powerful military figures in the nation. He walked down the center aisle, with measured steps, his polished boots echoing against the marble floor. Every executive who had laughed at me minutes earlier stood at rigid attention, terrified by the federal authority radiating from his presence. He stopped at the foot of the stage and locked his eyes onto Richard's face. "You called me a broken-down soldier," my father said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I am General James Reed, Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. You owe my daughter 6 years of back wages for saving your miserable lives from federal prosecution." The words crushed Richard's fake aristocratic pride under the weight of military honor. My father explained that the private Reed family trust had acquired all of Ashford Capital's defaulted bonds and debt obligations. The encrypted stylus was placed in my hands. The federal court injunction displayed on the screens, showing the transfer of ownership. I took the stylus from my father's hand and looked at the screen where Ashford Capital Partners stood ready for transfer to the Reed Foundation for Military Families. Gregory dragged himself across the carpet on his knees, grabbing the hem of my evening gown with trembling hands. Tears streamed down his face. "Claire," Remember our wedding vows, he sobbed. I love you. I'll make my father step down. We can rule this empire together. I looked down at his weeping, cowardly face, remembering the thunderous slap he'd delivered, the 6 years of systematic humiliation, the financial control, the isolation. I pressed the stylus to the glass screen and signed my full military name. Captain Mackenzie Reed, United States Army Intelligence. The Ashford Capital Partners logo dissolved into red dust on the screens above us, replaced by the golden crest of the Reed Foundation. 600 guests erupted into applause. Patricia abandoned her dignity and rushed onto the stage, dropping to her knees beside Gregory, grabbing my hands with theatrical desperation. We're family, Mackenzie, she cried. Don't destroy your future grandchildren's inheritance over a minor domestic misunderstanding. Look at your lip. Harrison is just stressed. I pulled my hands from her grasp with cold precision, refusing to let her skin touch mine for another second. I didn't turn to my father or brother to speak for me. I stepped forward to deliver the final accounting myself. I looked directly at Gregory and commanded sharply, "Stand up on your feet and face me." When he whimpered and remained on his knees, I reached down, grabbed him by his silk shirt collar, and hauled him to his feet with the physical strength I'd developed during military deployment. I retrieved a corporate termination notice from David's legal briefcase and pressed it directly against Gregory's chest. "Read this aloud to your friends," I commanded coldly. "You didn't marry a wife. You imported a hostage. Your lease is officially expired." Trembling and weeping, he read the words, terminating his employment and access to all company assets in front of 600 witnesses who recorded his complete humiliation. I raised my left hand where the 3-carat diamond wedding ring glittered under the ballroom chandeliers. For 6 years, that ring had felt like an iron shackle. I grasped it with my right thumb and forefinger, twisted it over my knuckle, and held it over Gregory's half-empty champagne flute from his earlier toast. I let the ring drop into the golden liquid. It hit the bottom with a sharp, heavy clink that resonated through the stage microphone. "Keep the diamond to pay for your federal defense attorney," I said, pushing the flute toward his chest. "My legal team won't offer you a single penny in settlement." I turned my back on Gregory, Patricia, and Richard, refusing to grant them another glance from my eyes. My father, General James Reed, stepped beside me, offering his right arm in formal military fashion. His 4 silver stars gleamed like shields of absolute protection. I linked my arm through his, straightened my spine until I stood at full military height, and began walking down the center aisle alongside David. The 600 guests parted before us, bowing their heads in silent respect. Federal agents moved forward to escort Gregory and Richard out in steel handcuffs while hotel security opened the mahogany doors to the cool Denver night air. 7 days later, I stood on the tarmac of Buckley Space Force Base, watching the first rays of sunrise break over the eastern horizon. I wore my tailored Army Class A intelligence officer uniform, my captain's bars polished and gleaming on my shoulders, my combat ribbons resting proudly over my left breast. The split on my lip had healed into a small white line, a physical reminder of the final night of civilian servitude, the catalyst that sparked everything. My father stood beside me with a hot cup of black coffee, his weathered face quiet and peaceful. We didn't speak about the Ashford family residing in federal detention cells awaiting trial. They had ceased to exist in our reality. David carried a leather binder stamped with the golden emblem of the Department of Defense. Inside was the finalized charter for the Reed Foundation for Military Families, capitalized entirely by the liquidated Ashford assets. We'd converted their estates, their corporate towers, their offshore accounts into a sanctuary, designed to provide legal aid, housing assistance, and financial retraining for abuse survivors and recovering combat veterans. I pressed the pen to the charter document, writing my full legal name and military rank with bold, sweeping strokes. 3 young female veterans standing in formation near a military transport plane rendered a crisp, synchronized salute. I returned their salute with sharp precision, feeling my heart filled with a sense of purpose that 6 years of wealth could never provide. My father placed his large hand on my shoulder, giving it a firm, proud squeeze. I turned to look at him and David, understanding that my 6-year ordeal hadn't been wasted. It had been a training ground that forged my spirit into something unbreakable. "We don't survive the darkness just to wear our scars as chains," I said quietly. We survived to build a fortress where no one else has to fight alone. The military transport throttled up its engines, releasing a powerful roar that shook the tarmac beneath our boots. I walked toward the flight line alongside my father and brother, feeling the warm morning light across my face, illuminating the silver captain's bars on my shoulders. I was no longer the broken girl standing in a marble foyer begging for respect. I was a military commander, a daughter of a 4-star general, the master of my own destiny, surrounded by a brotherhood that valued honor above money. I took a deep, liberating breath and stepped forward into the light. My past was buried. My enemies were facing the justice they'd created for themselves. My future was mine alone to command. Sometimes walking away from toxic bloodlines to build your own peace is the greatest victory of all. If you're struggling in a situation like Mackenzie's, please reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline or a trusted counselor. Your strength matters. Like this video and subscribe to Honest Stories Official for more stories of survival and triumph. Share your own experiences in the comments, because your courage might be exactly what someone else needs to hear.